Today, I am going to be talking about the development and implantation of the blastocyst. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about it in 4 separate sets of days: day 7, day 8 to 10, day 10 to 12, and day 12 to 14. On day 7, finger-like extensions or projections called the cincture trophoblast basically project outwards from the trophoblastic layer of the blastocyst, which is essentially a cuboidal layer of cells. And this blastocyst basically contains something called a hypoblast and an epiblast. And so a hypoblast and an epiblast get to form over here in this region. But essentially what happens, like I mentioned earlier, is the cincture trophoblast, which are projections from the hypoblast, cincture trophoblast, which are projections of the trophoblast, gets projected towards the inner lining of the uterus. Yeah, inner lining of the uterus. Okay. On days, and the thing is, the cincture trophoblast essentially penetrates deep into the uterus in order to nourish the blastocyst by releasing their lipid and glycogen contents when they die or when they apoptose. On days 8 to 10, essentially what happens is the amniotic cavity gets formed, which which holds the fetus in place, and the embryonic discs and the primary yolk sac gets formed as well. Right? So what essentially happens over here is the embryonic disc gets formed, and the embryonic disc basically consists of the epiblast and the hypoblast, like I mentioned earlier. So they either form on day 7 or day 8 to 10. And what basically happens is the epiblast, which are columnar cells, and the hypoblast, which are cuboidal cells, they form and respectively reproduce either the amniotic cavity or the primary yolk sac. So these amnioblasts, which are part of the epiblast, what essentially happens is they will eventually line the amniotic cavity. So epiblasts differentiate further into amnioblasts, and they eventually line the amniotic cavity. The hypoblast cells, they also tend to migrate downwards towards the primary yolk sac. Right, so the primary yolk sac is what forms the extra embryonic mesoderm that's present on the outside of the blastocyst. Okay. If you look closely over here, there is something called a lacunar network. So this is formed by the cincture trophoblast, which is essentially filled with maternal blood and debris from the uterine gland. Right, so spiral uterine arteries, to be specific, they're filled with maternal blood and debris or um, products from the uterine gland are also present in this region. This mixture of the lacunar network and the debris is what forms something called an embryotroph, which nourishes the embryonic disc and allows it to gain oxygen and nutrition. Okay. On days 10 to 12, it's dealing with the final few stages of implantation. It's basically when the blastocyst gets completely embedded into the endometrial wall and gets filled by a fibrous plug, which is essentially generated by day 12 or day 11. Right? This is the fibrous plug I'm referring to. And essentially what happens on day 12 is the accumulation of glycogen and lipids in the cytoplasm of all the decidual cells. So decidual cells are the maternal cells that are involved in implantation from the mom side. And these secretory decidual cells basically help to provide immunity and prevent antigen rejection from any viruses or anything outside, which may potentially harm the fetus. On the final day, from days 12 to 14, what essentially happens is the lacunae, which is basically from the cincture trophoblast, they tend to form a complex network of endometrial capillaries. They tend to form a complex network with endometrial capillaries and essentially work towards the primitive circulation present in the placenta. Okay. The extra embryonic mesoderm, which is essentially present between the um, trophoblast and the primary yolk sac. What essentially happens here is it starts to develop a cavity known as the primary yolk sac and the secondary yolk sac. So, like we spoke about earlier, the amnioblasts form these cavities, right? So, these cavities tend to develop even further on days 12 to 14. And eventually, something called a chorion forms, which is a part of the flanking embryonic mesoderm. Eventually, the embryo gets connected to the second yolk sac by this chorion thing that I just mentioned. Right? It's not present over here, but it's an extra piece of information which you will go through in anatomy. But essentially, these chorionic villi, or more commonly referred to as chorion, um, essentially produces cellular extensions that overlie the cincture trophoblasts.